Virginia, 1852. A sprawling plantation makes under the summer sun, where wealth and power hide the darkest of secrets. Here, a father's pride is matched only by his cruelty, and his daughter is seen not as family, but as a commodity. One reckless gamble will change everything. Watch closely, because what happens next will tear a family apart, can leave Virginia forever altered. Don't blink, or you'll miss the scandal that shocked a state. If you enjoy these haunting tales of history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. The afternoon sun dipped low over the plantation, casting long shadows across the meticulously trimmed hedges and wide, dusty paths. The air was heavy with heat and a faint scent of tobacco and horses. Word had spread quickly among the wealthy landowners of Virginia. Today, the master of the Hawthorne estate would host a private poker game, one whispered about for weeks in nearby towns. The promise of high stakes and even higher drama had drawn an unusual crowd, eager to witness both fortune and scandal. The father, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face lined by years of arrogance, adjusted his waistcoat and polished his pocket watch. Every movement exuded wealth, confidence, and a dangerous impatience. He glanced over at his daughter, who sat quietly under the shade of a magnolia tree, fanning herself with a delicate handkerchief. Her eyes, wide and observant, betrayed a mix of fear and curiosity. Though young, she had learned the subtle signs of her father's mood, the twitch of a finger, the glint of satisfaction in his eyes when he believed he had outwitted another man. The first arrivals made their way along the gravel drive, a mix of fellow plantation owners, ambitious gamblers, and a few curious onlookers. They dismounted from horses, their boots kicking up dust, and exchanged polite bows and sly glances. Some carried card decks in leather cases, while others flaunted gold coins that glinted in the sunlight, a subtle reminder of the stakes involved. Rumors had already begun, whispered speculation that the father was not just skilled at cards, but ruthless in what he would wager. Inside the plantation's main hall, tables were arranged with precision. Velvet cloths covered polished oak surfaces, and crystal glasses waited to be filled with imported spirits. The father's loyal but anxious house servants flitted about, setting out chips and shuffling decks with trembling hands. The slave, silent yet alert, observed every detail, the placement of chairs, the reactions of the guests, the subtle twitch in the father's jaw whenever someone mentioned a bold bet. Despite being uninvited to participate, he understood the stakes in a way the others did not. Here, games were not just about money, they were about power, control, and sometimes lives. As the guests settled, laughter and conversation filled the air. Some spoke of distant plantations, new livestock, and the latest gossip from Richmond. Others leaned forward, eyes fixed on the father, sensing an undercurrent of tension beneath his easy smile. The daughter, still in her shaded corner, clutched her hands together, feeling a cold shiver run down her spine. There was something in her father's posture, something about the way he surveyed the room, that made her stomach twist with unease. A servant whispered to her that the father had promised a special wager for this evening, though no one could guess the nature of it. The daughter's heart pounded. She had overheard his boasts before, how he could win anything with the right hand, and now she feared what he might see as a prize. Meanwhile, the slave remained motionless, his eyes following every glance, every subtle nod exchanged between the father and his rivals. Something was coming, something none of them could yet name, but when the first cards were dealt, the game would change all of their lives forever. The poker table gleamed under the warm glow of hanging lanterns as the players gathered, their faces a mixture of excitement, arrogance, and concealed trepidation. Cards shuffled with sharp snaps, and the clinking of coins echoed across the hall. Laughter and boasts filled the air, yet beneath the joviality lay an invisible current of danger. Everyone in the room knew the master of Hawthorne Estate was not just skilled at cards, he was ruthless, and his victories often came at the expense of those who dared to challenge him. The father settled into his chair, chest puffed, chin lifted as he dealt the first hand. His eyes flicked toward his daughter, who had moved closer now, still under the shadow of a grand oak near the hall's entrance. She clutched her handkerchief tightly, the fabric damp with her sweat. Something in her father's gaze chilled her, a dangerous combination of pride and recklessness. She could feel it before the words were even spoken, that creeping dread that tonight the boundaries of right and wrong would be shattered as the first few rounds of cards were played, coins and small valuables exchanged hands. Some landowners grinned at their modest victories. Others gritted their teeth at minor losses. The father's laughter rang louder than the others, but there was a hardness behind it, a subtle tightening of his jaw that none but his daughter noticed. He leaned back, fingers drumming against the table, and then, with a sudden deliberate motion, he placed a hand over the center pile. The room fell silent. "I propose a wager," he said, his voice calm but heavy with menace. Every eye turned toward him. A wager unlike any other. "Tonight, I will bet." "My daughter." A collective gasp filled the hall. Conversations froze mid-sentence. A few of the men laughed nervously, unsure if he spoke in jest. But the daughter's stomach turned cold. Her hands trembled. She took a step back, heart hammering, as the father's gaze met hers with a terrifying intensity. "Against what?" "Someone stamme, a reedy dot." The father's smile widened, cruel and calculating. "Against this?" he said, pointing subtly toward the slave, who had remained standing quietly by the doorway, observing everything. The room went still, the air thick with shock. The slave's dark eyes met the father's, unflinching, calm yet piercing. Every muscle in the daughter's body stiffened. She had always known her father's pride, but she had never imagined such a gamble, one that reduced her very existence to a mere chip in a game of chance. The men at the table shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. A few whispered, questioning the sanity of the wager. Yet none dared speak directly against him. His reputation for cruelty and cunning had long silenced dissent. The daughter's voice finally trembled as she said, "Father, you can't." But the father waved her protest away with a dismissive flick of his hand. "I can, and I will. Tonight we test luck, and see whose lives are worth more." The slave's expression remained unreadable. Inside, however, he felt a cold surge of calculation. He understood the stakes. It was not just about cards or money. It was about freedom, survival, and the moral failure of the man across the table. He noticed every subtle twitch, every tell, every eye flicking nervously. Tonight, he would either be crushed under the father's arrogance, or he would rise in a way no one could predict. The daughter sank to a chair, covering her face with trembling hands. Servants and spectators whispered behind their hands. Even the seasoned gamblers, accustomed to high stakes and bold bets, felt a chill in the pit of their stomachs. The air had shifted. This was no ordinary game. It was a challenge to morality itself. As the father prepared to deal the cards for this ultimate wager, the room collectively held its breath. In that tense moment, the daughter, the slave, and the father all understood that one reckless decision could shatter more than just fortunes. It could destroy lives, families, and perhaps the very fabric of Virginia society. No one spoke. The shuffle of the decks seemed deafening. Coins rattled like distant thunder. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the father laid down the first card, sealing the beginning of a night that no one would ever forget. The hall was silent, the air thick with disbelief and tension. The father's gamble, the daughter against the slave, hung in the room like a dark cloud, pressing down on everyone present. Some of the landowners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Though many had seen cruelty in their lives, none had witnessed such audacity. A low murmur spread through the crowd, half incredulous, half fearful. It was as though a moral line had been crossed, one that could never be uncrossed. The daughter remained slumped in her chair, her hands covering her face. Her heart pounded, and her mind raced. How could a father treat his child as nothing more than a piece in a game? She could feel tears welling, but fear and shock kept them at bay. Every nerve in her body screamed to run, to flee the plantation, yet the walls of her world felt impossibly high. Her father's eyes never left her, gleaming with pride and dangerous confidence. The slave, standing near the doorway, observed the room with measured calm. He understood the stakes far better than most present. This was not merely a card game, but a test of survival and cunning. Every gesture of the father, every subtle twitch of a hand or lift of an eyebrow, was a tell to be remembered. He subtly noted the expressions of the other landowners, the ones who had laughed and scoffed just moments before. Some were wary, sensing that the wager had shifted the balance of power. Others were enthralled by the scandal, eager to see how far the father would go. Servants exchanged worried whispers among themselves. They had grown used to the father's arrogance, but tonight he had ventured into reckless territory. One older servant shook her head, murmuring under her breath, "Lord, have mercy. What has he done now?" The younger ones glanced nervously at the cards on the table, the coins stacked high, and then at the daughter, whose small frame seemed impossibly fragile against the weight of the moment. Outside the hall, news of the wager had begun to trickle through the grounds. A few of the workers paused in their tasks, drawn by the tension, their eyes wide as they overheard snippets of the conversation. Even they felt the tremor of fear ripple through the air, the sense that something irreversible had been set in motion. Back inside, the daughter's mind raced. She replayed every moment leading up to the wager, her father's casual cruelty, the hushed whispers of the guests, the unblinking gaze of the slave. She realized that the cards themselves were irrelevant. This game was about pride, power, and control, and she was caught in the crossfire. Yet a tiny spark of resolve began to grow. Even in fear, she understood that submission would not save her. Something, somewhere, demanded she watch, learn, and perhaps act out. The father clapped his hands together sharply, breaking the murmurs. Enough chatter. He barked, his voice commanding attention. The game begins. Eyes on the cards. Let us see whose luck will rule tonight. His confidence was unnerving, his demeanor unshakable. And yet, beneath it all, even he could sense the tension in the room, the growing awareness that his wager had shifted the balance in ways he could not fully control. A hush fell over the hall once more. Every gaze was fixed on the table, every heart racing in anticipation. The daughter's pulse thumped in rhythm with the soft clatter of the first shuffled deck. The slave, silent and observant, prepared himself. And the father, proud and imperious, prepared to deal a hand that would decide not only the game, but the fate of all involved. The father shuffled the cards with a deliberate precision, each flick and snap of the deck echoing across the hushed hall. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if every breath might ignite the tension that had settled like a dense fog. Guests leaned forward, eyes glinting with anticipation, some curious, some apprehensive, all aware that tonight's game would be unlike any they had witnessed before. The stakes were no longer measured merely in coins and valuables. Human lives, dignity, and freedom had been placed on the table. The first hand was dealt. The father's eyes never left the daughter, a subtle gleam of cruelty and pride mingling in their depths. She sat rigidly in her chair, hands trembling slightly as she watched the motion of the cards. Every shuffle, every flick of the wrist was a reminder that she had become an object of a reckless bet. Her heart thudded violently, yet she forced herself to breathe, to observe, to endure. Across the table, the slave remained quiet, almost invisible, though his presence carried an undeniable weight. His dark eyes scanned each player carefully, noting the smallest gestures, a twitch of a finger, a flinch at a coin placed on the table, a bead of sweat forming on a brow. Every subtle motion was a clue, every expression a potential advantage. Though uninvited to play formally, he understood the game's rhythm and its stakes better than most. It was not luck that would decide the night. It was calculation, courage, and patience. The other landowners exchanged wary glances as the first round unfolded. A few scoffed at the audacity of the wager. Others feigned amusement, masking unease beneath practiced smiles. Coins clinked, laughter rang out, but it was hollow, tense, a fragile veneer over a room brimming with dread. Each card revealed was met with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The father maintained a calm, almost theatrical demeanor, though the slightest tightening of his jaw betrayed the slightest tension beneath his arrogance. As the rounds progressed, the daughter began to notice patterns, small tells, the way her father's eyes lingered on certain cards, how the other players shifted under pressure. Her fear began to mix with a growing sense of awareness, a subtle understanding of the game unfolding before her. Meanwhile, the slave observed her, noting the quickening of her pulse, the tension in her shoulders. Though they could not speak, an unspoken connection began to form. Both victims, both trapped in the consequences of the father's reckless pride, yet both capable of subtle resistance. The father raised his voice, boasting loudly, "This game is mine. Luck favors the bold, and tonight none are bolder than I." Coins rattled as he pushed a large stack toward the center. The men around him laughed nervously, aware that the bravado masked something far darker, the desperation of a man betting more than money. The daughter's stomach twisted at the sight, realizing that this display of power was intended not only to intimidate his rivals, but to assert control over her very existence. By the third round, tension had reached a near breaking point. The other landowners had begun to grasp the weight of the wager, their amusement giving way to unease. Some glanced toward the daughter, whispering discreetly. Others glanced at the silent slave, the implications dawning slowly. The father's hand hovered over the deck, ready to deal the next card with all the calculated authority of a man convinced of his own invincibility. In the corner, a servant dared a nervous glance, trembling as they adjusted a chip. Outside, a faint wind rustled the trees, as if nature itself had sensed the cruelty unfolding inside. The daughter's hands clenched in her lap. She could not intervene, could not speak, yet she felt an inner resolve stirring. Survival, resilience, and defiance all coalescing in the quiet determination of a young woman forced to witness the unimaginable. As the father dealt the fourth round, a subtle tension rippled through the room. Every glance, every shuffle, every coin placed on the table seemed magnified, charged with potential catastrophe. The slave, the daughter, and the guests all understood that the outcome of this night would extend far beyond the table. It would decide not only fortunes, but the very fates of those who had been made pawns in a man's reckless ambition. The room had grown almost unbearably still. The laughter, the whispers, and the faint clinking of coins that had accompanied the earlier rounds were gone, replaced by a suffocating silence. Every eye was fixed on the poker table, where the father sat like a predator, exuding confidence and menace. His chest heaved slightly as he shuffled the deck, his fingers trembling ever so subtly, a tell he would never admit existed. The daughter sat rigidly in her chair, hands pressed together, knuckles white, heart racing with a fear that had reached its apex. The slave, standing quietly near the wall, observed each movement with sharp focus. His dark eyes darted from the father to the other players, noting subtle cues. A twitch, a hesitant glance, a bead of sweat forming at a temple. Every detail could matter. Though the father was convinced of his control, the slave understood that luck alone would not decide this game. Intelligence, timing, and courage would be the true determinants. The first few cards of the final hand were dealt. The father's arrogance was palpable, his smug grin seemingly impenetrable. Yet there was a hidden tension in the slight twitch of his left hand, and the way his eyes narrowed when glancing at the daughter. She could feel it, a faint but unmistakable vibration of fear beneath his confidence. Her pulse quickened. She knew that her very existence was tethered to the cards, the whims of her father, and the unseen forces in play across the table. Coins and stakes were pushed into the center, forming a mound that seemed almost symbolic, a tangible representation of the gamble, not in money, but in human lives. The daughter's stomach churned as she glanced at the slave, who remained composed, calculating. Though he could not speak, there was a quiet understanding between them. This was a test of courage, and only those who could endure the storm of cruelty and calculation would emerge intact. The father leaned forward, voice sharp and commanding. "Place your bets," he barked, scanning the faces of his rivals with predatory precision. Some hesitated, unsure whether to challenge him. Others followed his lead, stacking coins nervously, aware that defiance could mean ruin. The daughter's eyes darted around the room, catching subtle signs of fear, curiosity, and concealed admiration from the other landowners. She realized that the stakes were no longer personal. They were now a spectacle, a drama of morality, power, and control. As the cards were revealed, tension mounted. The first few reveals brought gasps, laughter, and muttered curses from the audience. The father maintained a veneer of composure, though beads of sweat now dotted his brow. The daughter's heart thumped violently, each beat echoing the rhythm of the game, as if time itself had slowed. The slave's eyes remained fixed on the table, each movement calculated, each reaction deliberate. He understood that this hand could determine not only his fate, but the daughter's, and perhaps the moral reckoning of everyone present. The decisive moment approached. The father placed his final card down with a flourish, eyes glittering with triumph. "This is it," he declared. "Fortune favors the bold." Yet in that instant, a flicker of doubt crossed his features, a recognition, fleeting but undeniable, that perhaps he had miscalculated. The daughter caught it, her chest tightening. There was still hope, however small, that the scales could tip in a direction no one had anticipated. The slave made his move with quiet precision, revealing a card that shifted the balance instantly. Gasps filled the hall. The father's triumphant smile faltered, replaced by shock and anger. The daughter's breath caught in her throat. For the first time, she saw her father as vulnerable, imperfect, mortal. The other landowners whispered frantically, some incredulous, others relieved at the reversal of fortune. Chaos erupted in the room. The father slammed his fists on the table, crimson with rage, knocking coins and chips into disarray. "Impossible!" he roared. "This cannot be." The daughter, trembling but resolute, realized that the outcome of this night had altered more than just the game. It had upended the power dynamic in the room. The slave, calm and composed, had played with intelligence, courage, and strategy, proving that morality and wit could triumph over arrogance and cruelty. For the daughter, the moment was transformative. She had witnessed firsthand the consequences of her father's recklessness, the fragility of pride, and the strength that could rise from observation and patience. She understood that survival was not merely about submission. It was about awareness, cunning, and the courage to endure. Her gaze met the slave's, a silent acknowledgment passing between them. They had survived, and in some way, they had reclaimed a measure of control over their lives. The father, humiliated and furious, retreated mentally into his fortress of pride, refusing to acknowledge the defeat fully. Yet the room had changed irrevocably. Conversations were subdued, whispers replaced laughter, and the air was thick with the realization that this night would be remembered for years to come. The consequences of one reckless wager had begun to ripple outward, touching every life in the hall, and beyond, across the plantation, and into the wider society of Virginia. As the final coins were gathered and the cards collected, an uneasy stillness settled over the room. The daughter, her hands no longer trembling, sat with a newfound resolve. The slave returned to his place, silent yet victorious in a quiet, moral way. And the father, despite his wealth, influence, and bluster, had learned the hard truth. Arrogance and cruelty could bring even the most powerful man to ruin. Tonight, a game had ended, but the scars it left would shape every life in that hall forever. The echoes of the final hand lingered in the Hawthorne estate long after the cards were cleared and the coins returned to their owners. The father sat in grim silence, chest heaving, eyes burning with a mixture of fury, disbelief, and wounded pride. His carefully curated image of control and superiority had been shattered in a single hand of cards. Around him, the room buzzed with a different energy, now not excitement, not anticipation, but a sober awareness that something unprecedented had occurred. The daughter, still pale from shock, rose slowly from her chair. Each step felt heavy, as though the weight of the night had settled on her shoulders permanently. She glanced at the slave, who had returned to a quiet corner, his demeanor calm yet unmistakably triumphant. The unspoken bond between them had grown stronger during the game, a subtle understanding that they had survived something far greater than mere chance. She realized that she was no longer just a pawn. The experience had awakened in her a spark of awareness and resilience. Word of the wager and its shocking outcome spread quickly. Servants whispered in hushed tones, some incredulous, others horrified. Outside the estate, rumors traveled faster than the wind. Neighbors spoke in tight-lipped murmurs, speculating on the father's recklessness and the audacity of staking a daughter against a slave. The story became a local sensation. Some condemned the father's cruelty, while others marveled at the daring twist of fate. The plantation, once a symbol of wealth and control, now carried an aura of scandal and instability. The father attempted to regain his composure, summoning servants and family alike, but the cracks in his authority were evident. Workers avoided his gaze, exchanging furtive glances, subtly questioning his judgment. The once robust hierarchy of the plantation began to erode, as fear and distrust quietly seeped into the daily routines of laborers and household staff. Even minor tasks felt laden with tension, each interaction a reminder that the man who had once commanded unquestioned obedience was now flawed, fallible, and vulnerable to scrutiny. In the nearby town, the story spread like wildfire. Merchants, clergy, and landowners debated the morality and audacity of the wager, some using it as an example of unchecked pride and cruelty, others as a cautionary tale of fortune's fickle nature. Conversations in parlors and taverns echoed with disbelief. How could a father so recklessly endanger his child's well-being? The narrative painted him not as a figure of power, but of hubris, a man whose arrogance had consequences far beyond the walls of his estate. The daughter's own perspective shifted dramatically. She began to understand the broader implications of the events. Her father's pride was not merely a personal flaw, but a mirror of a society that commodified women, enslaved others, and valued wealth over morality. Each whisper she overheard, each disapproving glance from neighbors, reinforced the lesson that unchecked power could have devastating consequences. The slave, too, became an emblem of subtle triumph. His calm intelligence and strategic foresight had not only preserved his own life, but also undermined the father's perceived omnipotence. Tension simmered within the household. The father lashed out sporadically, attempting to reassert control, yet his attempts fell short. The daughter, emboldened by the events, began to test the limits of her own agency. Small gestures of defiance and quiet observation that hinted at a growing independence. The plantation's former image of unquestioned authority was replaced by uncertainty, whispers of rebellion, and the undeniable impression that a moral reckoning was unfolding. As the weeks passed, the ripple effects reached beyond the estate. Local society began to question the behavior of those who wielded unchecked power. Some landowners adjusted their dealings, others grew cautious, fearful of similar public humiliation. The wager had become more than a scandal. It was a lesson, a warning that cruelty and arrogance, even when shielded by wealth, could bring ruin. The father's reputation was tarnished permanently, and the daughter's perspective had transformed entirely. She now recognized the fragile line between compliance and resistance, between fear and courage. By the end of this period, the plantation was still standing, but its sense of security and control had been irrevocably shaken. The father's wealth could not erase the humiliation or the moral consequences of his actions. The daughter, strengthened by the ordeal, and the slave, quietly victorious, had both emerged as subtle agents of change within a crumbling hierarchy. Virginia, in a small but meaningful way, had begun to feel the tremors of this moral upheaval. The game was over, yet its consequences would echo far longer than anyone had anticipated. The aftermath of the game settled over the Hawthorne estate like a heavy fog. The laughter and chatter of previous days had been replaced by a tense quiet, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the moral weight of what had transpired. The daughter sat by the window of her chamber, staring out at the sprawling fields bathed in the fading light of late afternoon. Her mind replayed every moment of the night, the shuffle of cards, the clatter of coins, the sharp glances, the tension in the father's eyes. Each memory was a lesson, each heartbeat a reminder of her own vulnerability and her emerging strength. She realized that the fear she had felt, raw and consuming as it was, had also been transformative. The knowledge that her father could treat her as a mere commodity ignited something inside her, spark of defiance and awareness that would not be easily extinguished. She understood, for the first time, that survival in this world required more than obedience. It required observation, courage, and the ability to act when opportunity arose. Meanwhile, the slave moved quietly among the remaining servants and laborers, his demeanor calm but resolute. He had survived the wager, but more importantly, he had demonstrated the power of intelligence and patience in the face of overwhelming cruelty. His subtle victory had shifted the perception of those around him. He was no longer merely a servant, a pawn in someone else's ambition. Though still constrained by the brutal realities of his world, he had proven that skill, insight, and moral fortitude could alter even the most seemingly insurmountable power structures. The daughter and the slave met occasionally in passing, their glances carrying unspoken acknowledgment. Each understood that the game had changed more than fortunes. It had altered their awareness of themselves and of the people around them. The daughter saw courage and cunning where she had once only seen submission. The slave saw resilience and intellect where he had once only endured oppression. A subtle partnership, born of shared trials, began to form an understanding that in a world ruled by power and pride, survival and subtle resistance were intertwined. The father, meanwhile, roamed the halls in restless agitation. His attempts to regain control were increasingly futile. The servants no longer approached him with the same deference, and the daughter's quiet, newfound independence was a constant reminder of his failure. He could still wield wealth and authority, but the moral authority he had once assumed was gone. Pride alone could not undo the consequences of his reckless gamble. Outside, The estate itself seemed to mirror the transformation occurring within. The fields, once symbols of control and prosperity, now felt like a stage on which the drama of human folly had played out. Shadows stretched longer, and the wind seemed to whisper of lessons learned and power questioned. In the quiet reflection of twilight, it was clear that the events of that night had set in motion a chain of understanding and subtle empowerment. By the end of the day, the daughter had begun to recognize the strength within herself, the courage to endure, to observe, and to act. The slave had reaffirmed the power of intelligence and moral fortitude. Together, in separate yet intertwined ways, they had begun to reclaim agency in a world determined to deny them both. The Hawthorne estate had been shaken to its core, and its inhabitants had been irrevocably transformed. The consequences of one reckless gamble would ripple through their lives forever, but amidst fear and humiliation, a quiet resilience had emerged, a moral and psychological victory that no wealth or arrogance could undo. The Hawthorne estate, once a symbol of unchallenged wealth and authority, now stood as a testament to the consequences of arrogance and cruelty. The father wandered its halls with an air of defeated pride. His wealth remained, but the respect and fear he once commanded had fractured, leaving only whispers of scandal and moral failure in its wake. The estate's employees moved with subtle defiance, their loyalty tempered by the awareness that the master who had gambled human lives could no longer be trusted. The daughter, transformed by the night's events, moved through the household with quiet confidence. Her fear had been replaced by understanding and awareness of her own resilience and capacity for judgment. Though still young, she recognized the power of observation and strategic thought. The experience had revealed the fragility of authority and the importance of moral courage. In her eyes lingered a quiet determination. She would no longer be a pawn in her father's reckless games. The slave, once merely an observer, had emerged with his intelligence and courage subtly affirmed. Though still bound by the harsh realities of his world, he had gained an unspoken respect and newfound moral authority within the household. His role in the wager had demonstrated that patience, foresight, and courage could challenge even the most arrogant of men. He and the daughter shared fleeting glances that spoke volumes, acknowledgment of survival, understanding, and the quiet triumph of human resilience. Beyond the plantation, the events of that night rippled through Virginia. Conversations in taverns, churches, and neighboring estates revolved around the audacity of the wager and its shocking consequences. The story became a cautionary tale, a vivid illustration of how unchecked pride and moral corruption could unravel not only a family, but the fabric of society. The father's reputation, once untouchable, was forever tarnished. The estate itself became a symbol of caution, a reminder that human lives were not commodities to be staked for amusement or pride. As twilight settled over the plantation, shadows stretched across the fields, whispering of lessons learned too late. The daughter and the slave, in their separate spheres, had discovered agency, resilience, and moral insight. Virginia, too, had been subtly changed as society, reminded that power without conscience carries consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. The reckless gamble had ended, but its lessons endured. One man's pride could destroy a household, yet even in the darkest circumstances, courage, intelligence, and integrity could prevail.